Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Element and Architecture podcast. And in this episode, we are going to be discussing the most ancient architecture we have discussed on this podcast series. And the architecture we are talking about today is none other than the Forbidden City in Beijing, China, otherwise known as the Imperial Palace. Throughout thousands of years of Chinese imperial history, with the many palaces of each dynasty, the only imperial palace that remains today are that of the Ming and Qing dynasty. And this palace, used to house the politics, the political activities of the nation throughout the Ming and Qing dynasty, is the Forbidden City. Despite being first built in 1420, the Forbidden City remains as the star of the imperial palaces built throughout Chinese history. Why? Well, it's because of its architectural and construction technologies deriving and being improved upon from the former imperial palaces of China of each dynasty. The Forbidden City remains as the architecture of the highest status in Chinese architectural history. And in this episode, we are going to be discussing some of its most important architectural features that gave it its status. Namely, we are going to be talking about materials, space and planning, as well as the structure of the Forbidden City of China. Firstly, let's start with talking about the materials involved in the construction of the Forbidden City. The most important material and probably the cornerstone of ancient Chinese architecture is wood. And during the construction of the Forbidden City, the wood materials are strictly regulated. And the wood that is being used are mainly Nanmu wood, which is a type of high-quality timber that is only prevalent in southwestern China, specifically in Sichuan. And why do they choose this type of wood? Well, it's because this type of timber, the Nanmu wood, provides strength and resistance against aging and decaying, basically. This wood, and basically all wood materials, are used in the structural framework in certain walls of the buildings in Forbidden City. And it's also being used for interior ornamentations, the buildings. So wood plays a very important role in the construction of the Forbidden City. And fun fact about this material is that because such large amounts of wood are being used in the construction, that many basically pain and suffering are being involved in the transportation of this material to the construction site. And that's basically the woods aspect about this building, and we are going to be focusing on the structure later that involves the wood, basically. And in addition to wood, tiles and bricks were used in the architecture as well. The city walls, along with the walls of the palaces, if you see any pictures of the Forbidden City, you can see the red part, or basically the palace walls, along with the walls of the entire city, that is basically the stone gray walls. They are all made of a type of material called type of brick called loam bricks, which are made from mud. And they are especially strong materials that further extends the life of the architecture. And that can explain why the Forbidden City is one of the longer lasting architectures in Chinese history. And I guess the choice of materials, specifically materials that aim for resistance and strength, is an explanation for sort of why the Forbidden City can last so long. It's also an important demonstration of the use of newer technologies in construction back then. And basically, if you see any pictures of the palace walls, they don't appear to be bricks, because we usually think of bricks as sort of like these like not red, you see. So but the palace walls we see are actually red. So how do they create this reddish color? Well, red clay is applied to the walls to create the red color of the palace walls, and the color specifically symbolizes luck in traditional Chinese culture. Furthermore, the roofs of the building are constructed with yellow glazed tiles, which appears in a golden yellowish hue that symbolizes power and status in Chinese culture. And thus, basically the saying 红墙黄瓦 perfectly captures the color palette of the Forbidden City. And it basically means red walls and yellow roofs. If you look at the Forbidden City from far away, you can see that you basically just see red and yellow. Red from the palace walls and yellow from the roofs, basically. And additionally, stone is also being used in the construction, the bridges, fencing, as well as the stair platforms in the Forbidden City. And that does it for the material aspect about the Forbidden City. Basically, in summary, wood is being used for the structure and framework of the architecture, while the walls you see for the city walls and the palace walls are constructed using bricks that are especially strong and are a demonstration of new Chinese construction technologies back then. And then also the yellow glazed tiles for the roofs that create the golden yellowish hue. And then it's just the stone from the construction of the bridges, fencing, as well as the stairs and platforms in this city. And that is it for the material section. And then we are moving on to the space and planning aspect of this architecture. The Forbidden City has perhaps one of the most meticulous compositions of all time. The site for the Forbidden City was precisely based on the site of palatial remnants of the Yuan dynasty, where the imperial palace situated in Beijing at that time was. And thus, having the remnants of the Yuan city saves much of the construction effort to plan and construct the Forbidden City. So basically, the planning and from everything from the location to the choice of location to the positioning of the Forbidden City really is derived from the remnants, or based on the remnants of the Yuan city from the Yuan dynasty. Furthermore, because the Forbidden City lacks water sources at that time during construction, water was basically led into the city from the Taiye Chi in the northwest. So Taiye Chi is basically this pool that contains water source. Basically, water is led from from the northwest side and into the Forbidden City. And this water that is led into the city forms the renowned Golden River, which spans horizontally, or basically spans across the Forbidden City. Additionally, the Forbidden City adheres to the principle of axial symmetry, which is a fundamental concept in its layout of the Forbidden City. And the entire complex is aligned along the central north-south axes, which puts the Forbidden City at the center of Beijing City. And that is another great way to put focus on the Forbidden City. This axis serves as the backbone of the palace and divides it into distinct sections. The meticulous arrangement of the buildings, courtyards, and gardens, along with this axis, creates a harmonious balance and a sense of order throughout the Forbidden City. And basically, that is for the layout of the Forbidden City, with all the central axes basically dividing the palace into different sections. And that creates sort of this harmonious layout of the Forbidden City. Furthermore, the planning also creates a stunning visual effect of the palace. The front gate of the palace is known as the Wumen, or the Meridian Palace, which guides the visitors into the Imperial Palace, which is more in front of the Meridian Gate. And when entering the Meridian Gate, the view is narrow from the walls of the passage that blocks the peripheral. And then as we enter the walls of the Meridian Gate and into the Imperial Palace, the main palaces are gradually revealed in the front, and the view expands into a vast space of imperial courtyard, creating a stunning visual effect that accentuates the scale and grandeur state of the Imperial Palace. And the placement of the palaces are also spectacular, with the Taihe Dian, or the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the most central palace functioning as the center of political activity, built in the center of the Forbidden City, which characterizes the importance of this palace. While the high elevated platform of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, which is located functions as the base of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, further accentuates the high status of the palace and further creates a spectacular visual effect with the Hall of Supreme Harmony. And that is basically it for the space and planning aspect of the Forbidden City. We basically talked about how the layout with the central axes and dividing it into different sections, and that creates this sort of harmonious effect, and that basically is the layout aspect of the general layout aspect of the Forbidden City. And then we also talked about the how the river, the city was planned, sort of. And then we talked about how from a viewer's standpoint, how it's sort of the planning, everything from the height of the palaces to the placement of them, creates a stunning visual effect that accentuates the high status of the palaces. So that is it for the space and planning aspect about the Forbidden City. And then we can finally move on to the last point, which is the structural aspect of the building. Now, the structural aspect of the building is going to be very technical, but it's going to be very spectacular, basically. It's very interesting. So, expanding on the idea of the elevated stone platforms that we have discussed with the planning aspect of the Forbidden City, the Hall of Supreme Harmony is the only palace in the Forbidden City that sits on a stone platform of 3 levels high, which basically serves as a base for the buildings. And it also creates the supreme status, or the effect of the supreme status of the emperor. Other palaces also have platforms with the stone fencing on each edge of the platform. The engravings on the fencings, stairways, and slopes depict traditional Chinese animals, which serves as a touch of ornamentation on the grandeur architecture. Now, let's move on to the structure of the building per se. 斗拱, or interlocking brackets. These interlocking wooden brackets are basically are visible beneath the eaves, or the curved part of the roof that goes up. And basically, the interlocking wooden brackets serve as a crucial structural component, actually. The interlocking wooden brackets not only provide stability and support to the roof structure, but also adds intricacy and complexity from the ornamentations of the interlocking wood, basically adding sort of this complexity to the structure of the palaces. And the general wooden beam structure is built along the depth direction of the palace, and it starts with the stone pillar foundations on which vertical columns are erected. And beams are then placed on top of the columns, and then claw columns are added on the beams. And what does mean basically? Well, it basically means it creates this progressively shortening and layering effect with the roof that creates the slope of the roof. And that creates the general framework for the palaces in Forbidden City, and also creates the foundation for the roof structure. And with the foundation of the roofs, the general shape of the roofs are then formed. Well, that might lead you to wonder about what the roofs are like in the Forbidden City. Well, the roof structures are particularly interesting. The palaces in the Forbidden City employ the hip and gable roof, or hip and gabled roof, which originated from Song Dynasty, and it is a type of roof design that combines both hipped, which is a sloping side, and gabled, which is the vertical end, that combines to create the roof structure of the major palaces. And the sweeping eaves that curve upwards at the corner creates a graceful upward reaching effect, but also is functional at directing rainwater away from the roof, while the overall shape of the hip and gable roof is a balance between symmetry/simplicity and ornamentation. And overall, in conclusion, we talked about this the materials aspect, which is about how materials are used in the building to create certain visual effects, as well as the spacing planning, which is about the layout and basically we talked about the river, the overall layout with the north and south axes dividing it into different sections, and also the stunning view that is created from the placement of the buildings. And finally, we talked about the structure, how the basically from everything from the platforms to the interlocking structure of the individual palaces. And then finally, we talked about the roof structure of the buildings, or the buildings in the Forbidden City. And that does it for this episode of the podcast. And in the next episode, we are going to be talking about another city that is quite interesting, that is modern, unlike this one. This one is quite ancient. So I'll see you guys in the next podcast. Bye.